Hi, and welcome to this PM and Friends podcast.
The important thing to look at when you're watching a government or a leadership team dealing with this type of crisis is whether they learn or not. Are they adapting? Are they trying things? Are they failing fast? Do they admit their mistakes? And do they learn from their mistakes and adjust the way they manage?
You just heard Bert Brugghemans. He's chief fire officer of the fire zone in Antwerp, Belgium. He's a very knowledgeable guy. He really is a true innovator and tinkerer, but also a CEO of the fire zone. So he deals with complexity and with crisis management for a very long time now. Really like the guy. He has a talk in this episode with Hugo Marynissen. He's my business partner in PM. And I'm hosting this session. I was asked to host a session between those two by Antwerp Management School, because Hugo and Bert are doing a research project, the future of firefighting, and they are sharing some insights from this research in this talk as well. And Antwerp Management School was so kind to let us disseminate this clip also via PM and Friends. Enjoy.
Bert, how do you look at this Corona event? Let's start off with that. How would you describe this kind of messy situation?
Well, Stan, thank you for your introduction. It was a very nice introduction. So, upon your question, how do we look at the Corona crisis? Well, I think we have a very difficult problem to manage. A global crisis, a pandemic flu. It causes a lot of problems, and not only problems in terms of healthcare, but also problems in terms of psychosocial situation, the interaction between people, economical situation. It's a really difficult problem, and what strikes me is that we really don't define what type of problem we are dealing with. Because it's very important, if you're looking at a crisis, you have to define what type of crisis you're dealing with. And most of the crises we deal with are, for example, fires or short bursts of problems. And afterwards, we have to deal with the mess it causes. But now we have an ongoing situation that causes problems in different areas of society. And it has a lot of different angles to look at. So I think we have to deal here with what we call a wicked problem. In normal situations, we deal with problems that are that have like a very clear start and end point, that have some relation between what you do and what happens on the field. But in this case, it's a very different kind of problem we are dealing with. And so I think we're dealing with a wicked problem. And maybe Hugo can tell something more about what a wicked problem really is.
Yep. Yeah, I think you're really spot on, Bert. The whole thing is the difference between, let's say, the traditional crisis situations, as you just described it. It's very often a quite linear process. While when we're looking at wicked problems, it's like in this figure, if you pull at one string, maybe something will move, but you don't unsolve the whole spaghetti ball. So there is no clear answer to where it comes from, where it will go to, what other problems or issues or crisis situations might occur. If you look at the Corona or the COVID-19 crisis, we see, for instance, that this is also triggering a recession, hopefully not a depression, but for sure we will go into a phase of financial recession. It might trigger other problems, not only health problems on the long term. Also, it might put some burden on the medical system. It might put some burden on the psychological system. People will have, that's at least what people are what experts are predicting, people will have mental issues over the next couple of weeks, months, years, probably. So it's not just one problem that you can grasp and then solve like you do in a traditional crisis situation, but it's a very wicked one. And one of the things that Jeff Coughlin was one of the guys who coined this term of wicked problem, or he came up with, is that he said, well, the problem is not understood until after the formulation of a solution. So we only understand the whole problem once we solved it. And that's exactly where we're in now. So we try to solve it, but we can't really understand it. This brings me to another element, and that other element is, and I would like to do a little poll at the beginning of this conversation. And the poll is this one. I want to ask to the audience how they look at this. If we look at the situation we're in right now, we can ask two questions. And one question is, do we live in a very ordered world where exceptionally things become chaotic? Or do we live in a very chaotic world where we manage to create a couple of oases of order? So I just want to ask the audience what their view is on this. So option number one is, do we live in an ordered world, or do we live in a chaotic world?
Okay, this is very interesting, because I've launched the poll, and it's like watching a horse race. It's like the two are going up. I see that we have 71% has voted, and yes, it's now chaotic world is leading. Hugo, I can already hint a little bit of that. Chaotic world is leading. Still an interesting percentage of ordered world. Exceptionally, things become chaotic. 81% has voted. So,
all right.
Right. Now is your time to vote, ladies and gentlemen. Go ahead. Then we can finish it. And it's interesting to see that we have these results. I'm going to share them with you. There you go.
Okay. So 80% says, well, we're living in chaos. And we try, or we can manage little oases of order. It's an interesting one, because when Bert and I are doing this kind of talks, we very often ask this question. And over the last couple of years, there were much more people saying, oh, no, everything is fine and it's well ordered, and occasionally something goes wrong. So I think we have to accept that we are in a very chaotic world, living in a chaotic world. And there is, we know from chaos theory and from complexity theory that there is a distinct difference between what is happening in nature, in the complex system of nature, versus what is happening with human behavior. And that human behavior is leading to much more chaos and much more complexity than what is happening in nature. So in that perspective, we can use this example of COVID-19 crisis as an example of how people are interfering, are interacting, trying to do things, and how the virus is spreading through people, not through the natural system, actually.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Hugo, to clarify this poll as well. Governments, I'm looking at governments because it's a complex situation. It's a wicked problem. It is, yes, people also see, 80% of the people also have a worldview on it's chaos to begin with. Now we look at our governments in Europe, and we look at our own in Belgium National Safety Board. They had a press conference yesterday to change the rules again, and then and immediately you see a public outcry that it's not good, and it's not coherent. So how should leadership teams in general deal with these kinds of events? Maybe Bert, in a more governance perspective, how do you look at it?
Well, I think knowing what a wicked problem is, and knowing the fact that you only have a clear view on what the problem is once you solve the problem, that leads automatically to the fact that you can't make that much decisions that are exactly spot on what you need. So if you look at the trajectory of our national government and all the other governments in Belgium, we have a lot, you know. But also, if you look at governments in other nations, then you see that they struggle a lot with this, because if you look at the poll and you see that 80% of the people attending this webinar are convinced that the fact that the world is chaotic, well, I don't see that in society. I think people are really expecting from the government that they make very clear and sound decisions that are spot on, that do exactly the right thing. But that's impossible in this kind of situation. And so if you look at, for example, the decisions of the Belgian government yesterday, well, they addressed the problem of the social situation. They addressed the problem of the fact that a lot of people are very lonely, are struggling with the fact that they have to keep in a very small bubble of people. And so they threw a solution at us, and the solution is not perfect, but it answers some problems. It answers the fact that you can be together with some of your family. It answers the problem that you can be together with some friends, be it in a very constricted way. And so it's a solution. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a solution. And whether they had decided to allow 2 people coming together, 4 people coming together, 16 people coming together, always there would have been people that could have criticized this decision. But the important thing to look at when you're watching a government or a leadership team dealing with this type of crisis is whether they learn or not. Are they adapting? Are they trying things? Are they failing fast? Do they admit their mistakes? And do they learn from their mistakes and adjust the way they manage? And last week or 2 weeks ago, we had a press conference from our national government, and they used the PowerPoint. And everybody knows this example. This was not a good way to communicate, and they know themselves. So I can tell this. And what you saw yesterday was much better communication. You saw even the Prime Minister joking with this, with the fact that they used the PowerPoint and that they didn't manage. And so, looking at this example, it tells me they learn from their mistakes, and that's a good thing. But you see that in the world they have to work in, those kinds of mistakes are not easily accepted. They get very heavily criticized on their mistakes, and I don't see that many opinion makers writing about the learning process our government makes. And I think that is the important thing to look at. So if you're in a leadership team dealing with a wicked problem, whether it is in this pandemic or whether it is in a problem you're facing as a company, for example, a tough new competitor or something happening in the world that affects your company that you don't have that much impact on, then it is important not to try to make the perfect decisions from the first time, but to build a crisis management that is based on agile working, trial and error, learning fast, and it is allowed to make decisions that are not perfect. The question is, do you learn from them? Do you adjust to your decisions? Do you make new decisions? Because I think the ambition to make the perfect decision is just it's a fantasy in a wicked situation.
Can I build on that, Bert? I think we are all raised to think in a very linear way. And if we look at crisis situations, and especially at wicked problems, there is no linear way. It's non-linear. It's very complex. It's very interactive. If what I just mentioned, if you pull at one string, the whole ball is shaking, but you're not unraveling it. And it comes from the fact that we are trained in our studies, in the way we are raised for almost about 200-300 years, that we always look from what is the cause and the effect. And if we do something, or if we aim for something, then this is the plan, and that's the way we go to that plan. And it's a straight line, and everything will be hunky-dory. Now, the reality is a little bit more complex, and we don't take that into account. So, referring to decisions made by governments, safety councils, etc., very often people just expect that there will be a magic stick, that you can use that magic stick, and then everything will go as smooth as possible, as in the upper picture in the plan. While there are a lot of hurdles, there are a lot of uncertainties, and very often people in crisis management, they say, well, crisis management, it's all about sense making. How do you make sense of the situation? How do you make sense in the situation? And how do you try to adapt? And how are you willing to drop your tools, to drop your procedures, guidelines, whatever, and just adapt and do the trial and error, as you just mentioned.
And I think what you mentioned, Hugo, the sense making, the situation awareness, this crisis has shown us that sense making and situation awareness can't be underestimated in crisis management. And when crises are becoming more and more complex and more difficult, the importance of good information, of intelligence, and of having good sense of what's going on is just one of the most important things. So if you're in a company or in a government and you have to deal with these kinds of complex and chaotic situations, then building a very good intelligence and situation awareness is one of the first things you have to do in order to prepare well and to be able to cope and adapt very early on in new crisis situations.
Yeah, agree.
Right. At this point, I would like to enter a little question which struck me on the chat. Thank you so much already, Maarten, Joja, Luc, to raise those questions. I will try to capture them and throw them in. I would like to take a question from Amy de Slovere that says, yeah, the answer of this chaotic or more ordered worldview probably is linked with the type of person who is answering this question. She says, yes, if a person can deal with chaos, probably it seems an ordered world. If the person likes to have rules, the world can seem chaotic. I really like this phrase. Maybe you guys can build on this on the perspective of, yeah, how to deal with this, how to prepare then for these kinds of problems, these kind of wicked problems.
It's a very good remark. Of course, it has to do with your personal mindset and how resilient you are in your mindset. So we see that, for instance, people can, and typically I think, and Bert, you have to confirm it or not, I think people who are working as first responders, they do have a different mindset, and they have a different look at what chaos might be and how to deal with chaos, rather than other people. And it's not a judgment, it's just a fact. Now, besides this is also a bit of a perception. So how do I interpret something that is happening, and how that might have an impact on me personally, or my family, or my work, or whatever. And make a distinction between that and just saying, well, if we look at the world, and I think the COVID-19 pandemic gives an excellent example of how this might have a massive impact on our daily lives, and we have no clue how to deal with it. We don't have a strong, solid answer just to solve it overnight. So yes, this is very chaotic. Yes, we don't have all the answers. Yes, things are moving, and knowledge we have today might be completely obsolete tomorrow. So if we can deal with that, and this question in that sense is a very good one, in a sense of, yeah, are you adaptive enough of dealing with that? And I think we just have to acknowledge that not everyone has the same state of mind.
And to add to that, the fact that it is a wicked problem is just a fact. You can't change that. So one of the things in a wicked problem is that you can't do it right for everybody. So absolutely, you have to deal with the fact that there are different cultures, that in different countries, different things are expected. So if you're dealing with a crisis in a country, or even in a company within that country, the culture of your company, the culture of your country defines for partly how you deal with the crisis. And that's one of the explanations why we see different approaches in China, in Europe, in different countries in Europe, in the States, and so on. So that's just a thing that is happening with wicked problems, that you have to take into account the culture, that you have to take into account the psychology of people, and adapt your solutions to the situation you're dealing with. And then again, if you're dealing with this wicked problem and you have people liking rules and you have people liking the chaos, then you have some solutions, and solutions can be very good for people liking rules and not good for people liking chaos, and the other way around. And you see this change in the way governments deal with the crisis. They go from a very rule-based approach, and now they go into a more like responsibility approach, and that's good for some people but not good for other people. So you can't make that one right decision.
Alrighty. Now, over the coming decade, we've seen the past decades. I've been doing this also for 15 years in crisis management, crisis communication. We've seen the situations, the events getting more and more complex. With today, we have this pandemic. This is the most complex crisis I've ever faced. Probably a lot of our attendees will have seen also very growing complexity within the crises they face. Now, if you look at the future of these events, it is highly unlikely that the complexity will decrease. No, probably it will increase. If you look at those hybrid threats, large-scale cyber threats, environmental threats coming up to our societies and our organizations, then what are some tips or some thoughts you can share with the attendees on once again the preparatory phase? What can we now start doing better coming from this pandemic, learning from this pandemic? Maybe Hugo?
Yeah. Well, a word that we hear very often these days is resilience. How do we build resilience, and how do we build resilient organizations, in a sense of that we can try to bounce back from this crisis situation? Now, my view on this is we don't have to bounce back, we have to bounce forward. And by doing this, the only way we can do this is by managing strategic paradoxes, as I call it. And this idea of managing strategic paradoxes, it's not my idea, it's an idea from David Denyer. He's a professor at Cranfield University in the UK, and he came up with this model, with this figure, this 2x2. So at one side, you're looking, so one X is the offensive, defensive X, and the other one is consistency and flexibility. And basically what he's saying is, if we are facing a crisis situation, or in this case, the COVID-19 pandemic, typically organizations are going into the lower left quadrant. So in a preventative control modus, they try to control as much as possible, stick to the goals, stick to the rules, stick to the processes and the routines that we know, and at the same time also try to protect your results, to lose as little money as possible. So to do some damage control. That's a typical situation that businesses, organizations are doing. Now, at the other side, there are also other opportunities that you can explore as a company or as an organization. So if we go to the upper left quadrant, it's performance optimization. Still has to do with going out, but being consistent. So improving and exploiting opportunities. So still you're sticking to your business, but you try to explore if there is anything else we can do. If we can increase on what we already know, but and then advance in this. So for instance, we see that quite a lot of tech companies are in this quadrant. Another one is, if we look at universities and education institutions, they're also trying to expand on that. Over the last weeks and months, within AMS, for instance, amazing efforts were done to bring courses online, to still have students following their courses and getting a degree at the end of the year. So that's the performance optimization. And I think not only at Antwerp Management School, but also I see in other universities and other educational organizations, they became better and better in that. At the upper right side, the quadrant there, it's between flexibility and offensive approach. So that's the adaptive innovation modus, where we see, for instance, over the last couple of weeks, a lot of new ideas that are popping up. And this is also where Bert was just mentioning too, like trial and error, do something. We see, for instance, breweries who start to create or to produce alcoholic hand gels. We saw other companies start to make facial masks. Does it work? Okay, move on and expand on that. If it doesn't work, drop it and go back to your core business. And then the final quadrant is the lower right one. It's the mindful action. And here we have again mindfulness. How do you make sense of things? And how do you reach out to others? And here we see a lot of initiatives, not only from companies, but also from society. People want to do something. They want to reach out to others. They want to do good. They want to respond to some needs in society, and therefore also supporting others. And it's also what companies are doing, organizations are doing, and that might broaden their perspective. So if we look at this strategic paradoxes, because it's a paradox between being consistent and at the same time being flexible, being defensive and also offensive. So if we look at this, it might give us a hint in how can we as organizations become more resilient, build on strengths, build on things that are happening within our organization, and try to prepare ourselves for probably a next wave that might come, because we all know, or if we listen to experts, the chance is quite high that in the fall of this year, a second wave of COVID-19 will hit us. So this might be some ideas that you can try to adapt and include in your organization.
If I can build on that, Hugo, I think I completely agree, and I think we have to do three things. The first thing is we have to make the strategic choices to invest in resilience, and to deal with these strategic paradoxes. We have to accept them in the boardroom and deal with them in the boardroom and make them discussable in the boardroom. That's certainly one thing. We have to look at what type of organization we are and how we can then deal with these complex, chaotic, sudden shocks we have to deal with. And then the last thing we have to do, and that's very important, and you already mentioned it, is we have to learn how to deal with these engaging activities that people do. Like in Belgium, you have this very strong action by people making their own face pieces and masks. We have more than 50,000 people sewing masks together, and that's very strong activity. And as a government, what I notice is that we don't have an interface to deal with this. We don't. What we try to do is we try to put rules on it and try to organize it, but that's not what is needed. These people, they need an interface with the government, and the government telling them these are our needs, and this has to be. This is the framework you're working in. We need this quality. We need this amount, and so on. And then they organize themselves. And you see this happening in societies during these kind of big crises, but you also see this in companies. And what I think we underestimate is the resilience that is in people, in the individual people, in the families, and so on. And we underestimate that. and we try to organize a lot of things that people can cope with them themselves. And I think this also refers to one of the questions in the chat, where I think I completely agree with the person asking the question. We underestimate the adaptability of people. Yesterday, in another webinar, one of the attendees of today mentioned that we have to rethink the complete concept of change management, because if you look back 6 weeks, in 2 or 3 days, companies completely adapted to this new situation without change management, without processes, without a strategic plan. They just did it. And why did they do it? Because there was, of course, a very strong incentive to do it. But on the other hand, people are able to adapt, are able to cope with new situations. We do this every day in our personal life. And only when the government comes into play, or companies come into play, and you really get this company culture and then people go into another mindset, I think, and they forget that they are resilient. But people are very resilient, and we have to work with that. So one of the lessons I take along from this crisis is, as a government, we really have to invest in building interfaces with citizens, and with citizens initiatives, and with citizens help. And as a government, we really have to be like a platform, like an iPhone. We have to build the iPhone. We have to build some of the basic apps that do like 30-40% of the work, and then for the long tail of problems, we have to look at other organizations, emerging organizations, the adaptability of people to cope with problems. So that's so true. I think a very important lesson from this crisis, and a very structural one that the government, but also companies have to work on. Because as a company, you can also get very much support from your own employees, and their resilience and their adaptability and their willingness to help solving the problems. Only yesterday, it's a completely different situation, but only yesterday we had a fire in a garage. And the boss of the garage told his people, you don't have to come in the next day because we had a fire. And all the employees were there to help cleaning up the mess and help getting the company back to work. And that is what people do when they feel the emergency. They just do it. And that's something we underestimate in our crisis management and in crisis management in companies.
No, that's so true. So it's the tension between this central control and how you steer things, and at the other side, relying on the expertise of people. And within every organization, people do have expertise. So let them try, let them do something. They know very well how to handle things because they are at the sharp end of the stick, as they say. But still, you need this balance. And dealing with the right balance, it's a very difficult one. And that's what we see. So yes, I do agree. Change management, we have to review the whole field of change management, which is a very interesting one, and look at the adaptability of people. That's one thing. A second one is you also have to manage the problem at the right level. And what we see here is that, yes, of course, government has to make some decisions at a certain level, but also people, and they always count on good knowledge and good behavior of people, but we as individuals, every one of us can also do the right things. So yeah, you need to have this central control, but that's at one level. How do we organize this? How do we organize the support, the help, etc.? And that's at a certain level. But then at another level, how you bring that into practice, you don't have to interfere on that when you are in a certain position. And the same in organizations. Yes, you have to go into this preventative control modus, where as an executive team, you have to control, you have to look at the budget, you have to look at the expenses, but at the same time, give small groups, individuals, whatever, the power to explore and to do new things. And if it works, support it. If it doesn't work, put it aside, learn from it, and do something different. But these are two different levels.
Yeah, I really like this notion. Thank you very much. It's very insightful to hear about these autonomous teams on the one hand, and still some central control on the other hand, because it is a paradox. to manage. Maybe, yeah, because you mentioned also that we have to reinvent or reimagine the change management principles or methods or models as well. What about risk management and crisis management? I've been dealing with those the past months and looking at, oh my God, a lot of the stuff I thought that was going to work always just did not work, or did not work how I thought it would work. So how about this change in your fields, Bert? Your fire, it's crisis management, Hugo on the theoretical, but also on the practical with PM level. How do you see this evolving over the coming months, or maybe even years and decades?
Well, I think the fact that we now look at crisis management and risk management as two different fields, and then maybe another field of business continuity management and so on. Well, I think these are all fields that that really have this one central thing together, and they deal with diverse events, complex crises, wicked problems, and so on, and they have to work together. If I look at my own organization, we also have risk management, either for our own organization, but also for the city, where we try to manage fire prevention, for example. That's really like a risk management activity, but we have to build very strong bridges between the crisis management and the risk management. In order to deal with these types of crises, with the fields united. Because if you look at risk management from one perspective and the crisis management, and you're looking at the same problem, well, then you will not have a complete view over the problem. So I think risk management, crisis management, business continuity management, emergency management, whatever management you want to call it, it's all crisis management. So I think all management is crisis management, but that's just my opinion. And so I think like bringing these fields together, learning from each other, and looking at different perspectives at problems is one of the very important things we have to do in this field. So that's my idea on that.
Mm. Yeah, it relates to this slide. How do you see within the war, and some leaders in this world are calling COVID-19 as a war that's surrounding us. So how do you see within this war some adverse events? What might pop up? How do we deal with this? What after the fog? And how do we prepare ourselves? And I fully agree, Bert. Then making a distinction between business continuity and risk management and crisis management and whatever you call it, and let everyone work in his or her team is not a solution. I can show you, and maybe we will do that a little bit later, some research that we did over the last couple of weeks as we speak, basically, during the COVID-19, where also the Antwerp Fire Brigade was involved and the Port of Antwerp was involved. And we can see that just bringing various people together, various disciplines, various fields of expertise and knowledge is the only way to anticipate and deal with this situation.
It's going back to expertise. I think we underestimate in our companies how important operational excellence and reference to expertise is. This is one of the basic rules to deal with complex situations, with adverse events. It's going back to expertise, and I think this is one of the shifts we need in the next months, bringing the experts more in front. And using their expertise in making good decisions, because in the end, of course, a decision has to be made, but the importance of experts has been shown very much lately.
Yeah, correct. And expertise is also trying to have some foresight. It's very easy after a crisis situation to look backwards and say, okay, this is what we learned, what we didn't learn, whatever. But having some foresight when you're surrounded by fog is a very important one. If you allow me, I'm happy to share this one. This is the research I just talked about, and it's in the bigger framework of the research we're doing for the Antwerp Fire Brigade. What you see here is on the upper left circle. This is the operations, normal operations of the Port of Antwerp. So the red dots, for your information, it's the leadership team. The purple blue dots is, let's say, the crisis/operations team, and the yellow dots are interactions, all the stakeholders they are in contact with. This is a picture from all the contacts and interactions they had in the pre-crisis network. So between end of January, beginning of March. And then you see when you go to beginning of March to mid-March, just before the pre-lockdown, you see that the port was already combining, teaming up. Operations is still in the middle, but you see the leadership team coming closer and having more contact. So the more in the middle you are, just to understand this kind of pictures, the more in the middle you are, the more context, the more issues you have, and the more ties you have with other participants or other stakeholders. Now, if you go to the lower left circle, that's during the lockdown, so from the 16th of March till the end of March. There you see you have a very dense network. All of a sudden, they jumped from 17 issues pre-corona to more than 190 issues. There were the number of ties, connections with other participants, with other stakeholders, is multiplied by 5. Just as a very dense network working together, they could control. And the result was that for not 1 minute, the port was out of control. It was not operating. The port was operating 24 hours a day during the whole period. And then from the end of March, which is a very interesting thing to see, is from the end of March, you see that the leadership team is going backwards. It's more relaxed in the sense of now it's more operations who are dealing with it. Yes, the ties, they are still high. They still have a highly dense network, but basically everything is under control. So this gives an excellent example of, and that links to the question, and excuse me for being so elaborating so long on your question, Stijn, but it gives an answer to, do we have to divide in crisis management and business continuity and risk management, etc., etc.? No, you see here, this is a very clear picture and example that you have to work as a team. No matter what rank, no matter what you're doing, you have to work as a team and create a network where all participants are involved, and try to manage that network that has only one option, only one goal, is keeping the ports operating.
Thank you, Hugo. I see on the chat as well, people like this visual. An additional question is if the lines on the graphic are more thick, more dense, like more black, does that mean the intensity is higher between the nodes?
No. So all the lines have the same thickness, just more lines, and they are overlapping each other. So you just see here you have 89 ties. Here you have it's multiplied by 5. So the number of interactions, the number of connectivities is much higher. So, and it's based on the logbooks of the crisis management team, of the leadership team, and of the nautical team, the operations team. So to whom are they reaching out? Who are they including in their network? And who are they not trying to steer, but having contacts to align to make sure that we can continue operations? That's basically how you have to interpret these figures.
Right, thank you, Hugo. Very insightful. Also, maybe just Bert, yeah, because this research, you're a big champion for this. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on research done in this field.
Yeah, I think it's very important that this kind of research is being done. What you see here is research that is being done during an active crisis. So that is learning and adapting on speed. So I think it's very important, and we also see some other initiatives where people are doing research questionnaires, for example, ongoing during the crisis, so that they can monitor the evolution of thinking processes and problems crisis teams are facing. So I'm very into combining practice and research, because I think if you're only looking at this from a practice point of view, then you miss some of the very important lessons, and that's why I think it's important. That's the reason we work together with the Antwerp Management School, and looking at this research. It's really it's confirming my feeling about this crisis, that while the crisis was exponentially growing in complexity, you also see that the network that is dealing with the crisis is increasing exponentially in complexity. And if I look at it from my perspective, then you have to zoom out, because, for example, I'm just one node in this network of the Port of Antwerp. But I have my own network with where I'm node in different types of these networks, and so you have a network of network, and how do you govern that? So that is one of the key questions we are now looking at in this research. So I think dealing with crisis management in the future will have to be about a combination of practice and very good research, hands-on research that is research like this. So I think it's important. Yes.
I refer Hugo. I really like that notion, Bert, of how to govern a network of networks. I think I'm gonna put that on a tile and put it in the office, because I really like it. Thank you for that.
If I can add one thing to that is, maybe most of you are familiar with the concept of high reliability organizations. It's a concept of Carl Weick and Roberts. Where we look at organizations that needs to be highly reliable in order to maintain, to face a potential crisis, and if a potential crisis happens, how to bounce back and how to intervene. I think we are now moving with this pandemic and with this wicked problem that we see here. I think we have to move to a high reliability network, as Bert just mentioned, and that's the network of these networks, because every organization in this graph, they have their own network, and they're trying to intervene, each on their level. So we have to look for how can we create a kind of, and it doesn't have to be, once again, formalized or be another body that is there. Maybe it comes very automatically, but how do you create a high reliability network that can count on each other, that can help each other to face the next pandemic, the next wicked problem, or the next huge crisis situation?
Right. Very nice. Thank you, guys. Looking at the time, I think we're going to add 3 hours to this webinar. We have to closely come to an end. So I would like to give you the opportunity to tie up what we've been talking about, each one of you, in a short retrospective. Maybe we start with Bert. One final statement?
Just two things. We added some lessons in the slides, but what I want to add is just two things, and it's one, because we talked a lot about how difficult it is, and on the first part is we have to be positive in crisis management, because if you're negative and you think everything will go wrong, then everything will go wrong, and that's what we see now. If you look at the learning process from the national government, for example, then you see positive things, and you have to create this positive environment to be able for people to be able to experiment. And the second thing is, if as a company you have to deal with this very wicked and complex situation, you can't underestimate the importance of communication. You can make mistakes, you can do it wrong, but you have to communicate very openly about it and just tell to people, like our Prime Minister did yesterday, well, the PowerPoint presentation wasn't a good idea, so okay, let's move on. And that's so important during these kind of crises, being positive and communication.
And then just to add one to that is, that the next normal, because that was one of the questions, what will be the new normal or the next normal? I truly believe that it will be a kind of balance between efficiency and resilience, as we saw in this graph from David Danier. But also a little bit between lean and mean, being a lean and mean organization that is agile, that is adaptive, that can move quickly, but also being a bit bulky in terms of having enough reserves, sufficient reserves that you can withstand a hit, that you can withstand a negative event, overcome it, and then move on. So it's also there, the paradox of lean and mean and being bulky. But at the end of the day, relax. It's only chaos.
This was the PM and Friends podcast for today. Take care, have fun, stay sane. Until next time.